I'm John Foster. Most of you have been at least one of these things before. I'm a librarian in the Adult Information Services Department, otherwise known as the Reference Department. All right, so this is the last of the talks in this year's series on American presidents of the 20th century. It's been a lot of fun for me. I've learned a lot of things that I never knew. I've really gotten I got a much greater sympathy for Teddy Roosevelt than I ever had. Not so much for Wilson. Truman, I'm really convinced, I had not thought that he was a great president until I read something about him, but I really have a lot of respect for Truman, and I have even more now that I've prepared for this talk, and we'll get into why that is in a little bit. And Eisenhower, who I sort of knew from the telling of my grandfather, who met him briefly. My grandfather was a lieutenant colonel in the 6th Armored Division, and then a colonel. Later on, he got transferred to the 9th Armored Division kind of late in the war, and then he was at the Command and General Staff School and at the European Comptroller's Office. So he met Eisenhower on a couple of occasions, although you weren't necessarily going to meet Eisenhower, even though he was in these, because he was one of these guys who Eisenhower's sort of management style was, I'm going to tell my subordinates what I want done, and then I'm just going to expect them to do it, and I'm not going to get into the minutia of it. And in fact, those times when he did get into the minutia of it, it usually didn't end up going all that well. So I will tell you that I've started to work on the lectures for next year, which are going to be on the American Revolution. In early December, they said to me, you're going to give a talk at the Concord Community Center. And I said, really? So I am. That will be on Alexander Hamilton. And then in 2019, I'm going to do the sort of ideological origins of the American Revolution. I'm going to do one on the kind of military history of the American Revolution. I'm going to do one on the Federalist Papers. I'm going to do another one on Hamilton, but I think that's going to be the sort of Federalist paper, which, he wrote like 55 of the 71 some papers. So I'm also going to do, next year, for those of you who don't know, is the 200th anniversary of the library. And we're going to be doing a whole bunch of things, and I'm going to do a talk next year on what's called the era of good feelings, which is the era in the early 19th century. So anyway, I've got these roughly scheduled out. I'll come out with literature about it long in advance, so you'll know when we're going to do this. Eisenhower is really is another absolutely fascinating guy. The United States has really been gifted by having a number of really fascinating characters. It's very rare that, okay, here's something I know about Germany. Most of you don't know probably that much about Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel is a Christian Democratic Union politician who's the Chancellor of Germany right now, and has been for a while. And Merkel is she's just a party politician. There's not very much that's very interesting about Angela Merkel, meaning no disrespect to her, but she's just not, you look at her and just like, there's just not that much that stands out. Whereas the United States has had a series of these really fascinating guys. Wilson was a little bit of Wilson's biggest problem was that he was kind of a pedant, but Teddy Roosevelt, this guy who was like riding jumping horses through Washington and constantly wanting to kind of go out to these places, and did San Juan Hill. And you have Truman, who was an artillery commander in the First World War, and then gets thrown into the presidency and manages to rise. People look at Truman, and especially his second term, and they think, oh God, look more sort of downs than ups, really. But Truman, think about the situation the guy was in. FDR was probably the toughest act to follow, with the possible exception of George Washington, in the history of the office of President of the United States. So, I think that you have to sort of judge Truman in those terms. And Eisenhower is another really fascinating character. The guy is very conservative, but he is sort of representative of a kind of conservatism that has been a little bit extirpated lately in the United States. A little bit extirpated is a little bit like a little bit pregnant. But I mean, it's you know, there's not much of the sort of like Bob Dole style of conservatism left in the United States, unfortunately. Or fortunately, depending on what you think of Bob Dole. But Truman is a really fascinating character, and I think one of the things that I hope to sort of communicate with this lecture is his really, Eisenhower, not Truman, smart guy. Eisenhower had a very interesting and very ethically engaged style of politics that, you know, one of the things I think about when I do these lectures is, what is it that we can learn from these people? And for the sort of problems that we face today. And really, there's a sense in which I think we've lost a kind of ethical style of leadership in this country. I mean, you can look at the presidents that we've had and you can say, you can point out their failings, and I'm not going to stand here and point them out individually. You all read the papers, right? But if there's one thing that we can learn from Eisenhower, I think, it's a kind of commitment to a sort of ethically engaged leadership that goes above the sort of specific party commitments that one might have. Eisenhower's family emigrated from the Saar region of Germany in the 18th century. Eisenhower means, it was originally Eisenhauer in the sort of German spelling, which means probably his ancestors were iron ore miners or smelters of some kind. Eventually it was sort of Americanized. It's not exactly clear when. He was born in Denison, Texas in 1890. His family was from, first they had lived in the Northeast in Pennsylvania. His mother was a member of a group called the River Brethren, who later became the Jehovah's Witnesses. His father was a very stern and somewhat unpleasant man. Now that said, whatever else you can say about his parents, they raised 6 very successful sons, Eisenhower being only the most successful, but you know, his brother Milton served in the Roosevelt administration and was also, I believe, the president of Kansas State, though one of his brothers was the president of Kansas State. He ended up going to West Point in 1911. He was a good student. He got in there on a sort of competitive exam type basis. The class of 1915 is sometimes referred to as the class the stars fell on, and the reason is because of the, I think, 127 graduates in the class, something like 57 of them became generals. You can see Eisenhower here on the football team. He was a very avid football player before he blew up his knee. He coached football after that. You can see over here on the right, on the left, for me, is Omar Bradley. Eisenhower graduated 61st in his class, which was 17 places below Omar Bradley. Omar Bradley was 44th in the class. The guy who graduated first in the class didn't go on to a particularly distinguished career, but if you look on Wikipedia, like, you can see these guys that up through the 1930s and 40s, you can see graduates of the West Point class of 1915 just absolutely sprinkled through and in very, very important positions. So when he graduated, he originally asked to be for service in the Philippines, which he didn't get. The Philippines was an interesting place to be in the teens. He was sent to serve in the infantry, Fort Sam Houston in Texas and also in Georgia. He met Mamie Dowd, who was the daughter of a very, very rich and very, very conservative family. From Denver, her father had made some very large amount of money and then retired. He made it in the East and then he retired out to Denver. It was one of those sort of love at first sight type of situations. They had a son in 1917. Whose name was also, who they called Icky. And this is one of the sort of stories that really stuck to me about Eisenhower. So when they were at Fort Meade in Maryland, Eisenhower hired a woman to be a maid in their house. But what he did not know was that she was just getting over a case of scarlet fever, and which in those days was very often lethal. And in fact, his son Ike, on whom he doted, came down with it. He wasn't allowed to be in the room where Ike was because he was contagious. And he watched through a window from a porch for 2 weeks while his son sickened and weakened and died. And it's one of those things, especially for those of you, who have children, it's, imagine what torment that must have been just to be within seeing distance of the boy, but not being able to do anything for him. And in fact, Eisenhower always felt that it was his fault. And it slightly damaged his relationship with Mamie. He apparently, every year on Ike's birthday for the rest of their life, he sent Mamie flowers in a way, because he felt like that he had hired this person and that it was his doing. And it never, it apparently never left him, according to most of his biographers. He was sent up to Pennsylvania. By 1917, he'd become a captain. He spent time at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, training officer candidates. He was sent to Leavenworth as an instructor. And then he was sent to Camp Colt, which was essentially on the Gettysburg battlefield, where he was engaged as a trainer for sort of nascent armored forces in the U.S. Army. This was a sort of time at which the tank was just sort of coming into military practice, and because it was clear at this point that the World War was going on quite extensively, so there was a feeling in the U.S. Army, among men in the U.S. Army, that the U.S. would eventually be involved, and Eisenhower certainly expected that he would be involved as a tank commander. So his unit was mobilized toward the middle of 1918 and prepared to be sent overseas. They were going to go in the last week of November, and then the armistice got signed. He told a friend of his at the time, "We're going to spend the rest of our lives trying to explain why it is that we didn't get to go over to Europe." And those of you who remember the Truman lecture will remember that Truman was an artillery commander in the First World War, and I think always, to the extent that Truman and Eisenhower could relate to each other, which they quite, for Truman's part, did very well. It was because Truman understood, as a sort of former officer, a lot about Eisenhower's character and a lot about his demeanor. So the army was really sort of cut down in size. Once the sort of Treaty of Versailles had been signed, American isolationism, which was always a very strong force in American politics in the late 19th and early 20th century, sort of reasserted itself, and also Congress wanted very much, and particularly the Republicans in Congress wanted very much, to cut the military budget so that the army was cut down basically to bare bones. But Ike, because he was from the Point, Eisenhower got to stay in. At one point, he sort of was involved in this transatlantic convoy. This was back at the time when, before the highway system, which in fact Eisenhower himself was responsible for building in the 1950s, when it was very difficult to actually drive from one coast of the United States to the other. And part of it was a sort of military exercise to see what it would be like to get a large quantity of sort of military hardware and troops from one coast to the other. He was at a number of postings, and he finally, there's a moment at which he and Mamie were kind of not living together for a lot of this time, partly because of the postings and for a number of other things. But he arranged for some sort of housing for her, and then it later came out that he had not organized it properly from a sort of financial perspective, and he was going to get court-martialed. And there was a very good chance that he was going to get court-martialed right out of the Army. And he basically appealed to one of his superiors who, taking pity on him, had him reassigned to duty in the Canal Zone in Panama, and convinced him to sort of drop this case against him. And I think it's a really interesting thing, because Eisenhower, if you read his efficiency reports, he was a very nailed down very nailed down officer. So it's kind of, it's sort of one of the peculiarities of his history that this happened to him. He worked, Panama, by the way, Mamie absolutely hated. She was a society girl from Denver, and she didn't speak Spanish, and she certainly was not into going out and rubbing shoulders with the hoi polloi. I mean, if you look at what Mamie Eisenhower spent much of the Second World War doing, she liked to shop, and the opportunities for the kind of shopping that she liked to do in Panama City were not that great. Eisenhower gets reassigned to the Battle Monuments Commission, which is basically, he's like editing Pershing's memoirs about the First World War. He gets assigned to Paris for a year. Then he becomes sort of the chief of staff for Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur takes him with him to the Philippines, where MacArthur is engaged in this weird thing where he's kind of reconfiguring the Philippine army. And what he discovered when he was with MacArthur was that MacArthur was a very political general, and was constantly he was one of those people who did not brook contradiction very well. And if you disagreed with him, he got very annoyed about it. And in fact, Eisenhower kept a sort of diary about this, which he later asked the librarians at the Eisenhower Library, Presidential Library, to destroy, and which they did not. And his son, John Eisenhower, later said, Eisenhower himself wrote later on, I said and wrote things about MacArthur that maybe in the kind of long stretch of understanding the man I wouldn't necessarily hold to now. But if you read the sort of diaries, he's very blunt about Eisenhower's failings. As the 30s go on, it becomes clear that things are getting ugly again in Europe. The U.S. Army starts kind of building up again. They have a series of extensive maneuvers in Louisiana. And the interesting thing, this is in 1941, the interesting thing about the maneuvers in Louisiana is that it's a series of war games going on over a gigantic kind of battlefield that they create. And the people who are really successful, Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, George Patton, you see them getting jumped up. I mean, so the U.S. Army in the interwar period was very much about seniority. I mean, you really moved along. Eisenhower was a major for about 16 years, and really the only way to sort of move up in the hierarchy was for other people at the top to move out. So, but what happens after the Louisiana maneuvers is the U.S. government starts kind of looking at the upper reaches of the officer corps of the U.S. Army and trying to cut away the chaff. And it's in this process that Eisenhower kind of jumps up. When he gets promoted to general, he gets promoted over something like 200 guys who were more senior than he was. But it was just because he was so clearly very efficient. But he was also very good at politics. Eisenhower, like MacArthur, was a political general. But he was much more subtle than MacArthur was, much more guarded in his way of expressing himself and his way of getting things done, as we will see. So Pearl Harbor happens on December 7th, 1941. MacArthur is transferred to Washington, D.C. Before that, he'd been with the 15th Infantry Division at Fort Lewis outside of Seattle. He gets assigned to the General Staff and the War Plans Department, trying to sort of figure out what they're going to do if we get involved in the war in Europe. And then he gets sent over with a couple of other generals to kind of look at the way that the U.S. Army, so this is in 1942, to sort of look at the way that the U.S. Army is functioning in Great Britain, which is going to be its jumping off point for anything that it's going to do. Now, at this point, too, already, Stalin is kind of pushing Roosevelt and Churchill for the opening of a second front, right? So the September 1940, the Russians invade the Soviet Union, the Nazis invade the Soviet Union, the summer of 1940. Boy, I'm losing my mind here, sorry. They invade Poland in September of 1939. That's why my brain is not working quite as well as it should. But Stalin is constantly looking for the opening of this second front. And the U.S. government becomes convinced now that they're in. Obviously before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government can't really do anything. They sort of organized Lend-Lease on a very shaky legal basis, but the Congress had made it clear before that point that they didn't want the U.S. government involving itself in another European war. But so Eisenhower goes over and kind of surveys the situation and says, well, look, like, it's being run on this very haphazard basis and not a lot of energy. And he comes back and they say, well, that's great. Why don't you be the guy running it? So Eisenhower gets transferred to the Allied headquarters in Great Britain. And this occasions an interesting and a change with sort of long-term significance in Eisenhower's life for a number of reasons. Number one, Mamie is back in Washington, and she doesn't really see him for 3.5 years after this. Eisenhower makes the acquaintance of this woman whose name is Kay Summersby. She was a former model, and she had worked as a driver for a number of British military figures, and she gets hired as Eisenhower's driver. And he decides that he really likes Kay Summersby, and he has an ongoing affair with Kay Summersby. Now, this is one of those things that has to be kind of read out of the correspondence and statements that people made at the time, but John Eisenhower, his son, is slightly cagey about it, but a lot of the other people, especially Omar Bradley, knew exactly what was going on. I mean, they were living together. And Kay Summersby basically became the sort of person who provided him with the sort of domestic support that he needed. They would have drinks together, they would play bridge together, they would sleep together. He took her with him all over, so that when Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, was going to happen in 1942, he was running it from Gibraltar, and as soon as he got things set up in Gibraltar, he started making plans to have the sort of female staff come over. So anyway, Kay Summersby and a bunch of the others get on a ship in Scotland, and they start sailing down, and the ship gets torpedoed. Well, one of the other people on the ship was a female correspondent for one of the U.S. Newspapers, and she wrote this big story about it, like, oh, look, that they were all got in this lifeboat. I mean, the ship wasn't blown up. Most of the people managed to get in this lifeboat. And here's Kay Summersby, who's General Eisenhower's driver. And it got back to the United States. And then it was like this open secret, what was going on. And it was very upsetting to Mamie. And in fact, so Eisenhower destroyed all of her letters to him. But she kept all of his letters to her. And so we have like half the conversation. But you can tell what she's saying, what must be in the letters, because he keeps sort of kind of defending himself about being a bad person. And it's clear that she has at least some inkling about what's going on here. And she's not very happy about it, but there's not really very much she can do about it either. Eisenhower was picked to, so there's a sort of running debate that goes on between the British and the United States about who's going to run the invasion of Europe. And the United States says, well, in fact, we're going to be providing eventually the bulk of the troops, so we should be one of us. In fact, like, more British soldiers go on the beaches on D-Day than American soldiers. You could see which way the tide was running. There's just a lot more of us than there are of them. And even with the Far Eastern theater, still we were going to put a lot of troops in. Now, the British were kind of hinky about Eisenhower running the show. And the reason was that he was just not that great as a battle commander. He had made some fairly serious mistakes, particularly during Operation Torch in North Africa, when he had allowed himself to be convinced to land the 3 task forces at a distance of about 300 miles apart. And this, to a great extent, was responsible for the disaster that the U.S. Army suffered in the Kasserine Pass when they just organized themselves in a way which was not going to be very effective and got taught a very painful lesson by Rommel. Now, at the same time, Eisenhower was very good at organizing things politically, and this was important because he was having to sort of ride herd on the ground in this debate about who was going to be the point man for the French. A lot of people, Churchill in particular, wanted it to be de Gaulle. Churchill and de Gaulle kind of liked each other, which is unusual because there's not that many people who met de Gaulle and found that they really liked the guy. The US government wanted a French general named Giraud. Giraud was a lot less experienced. He was older. He was a political general mostly. He was very much more conservative than de Gaulle, though it's not like de Gaulle was a raving liberal, but Giraud was a monarchist. Eisenhower was constantly having to sort of negotiate. The key factor here that's it's worth repeating is that, and I say repeating because I talked about this in the FDR lecture, FDR absolutely abhorred de Gaulle, and just absolutely could not stand him personally. Eisenhower had to kind of find a way, because what he discovered pretty quickly was that the French, such as they were, those who were not like fanatically loyal to the Vichy collaborationist government, were much more impressed with de Gaulle than they were about Giraud, and they kept sort of trying to sort of do these things, like the US government kept sort of like trying to promote Giraud, and it really never worked out. And finally, when it became clear, Eisenhower just sort of said, okay, I'm just going to take it on my own authority and make de Gaulle the guy. Now, why is this story important? And the reason is because, this is Sir Alan Brooke, and that's, of course, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Both of them were very experienced combat commanders. Sir Alan Brooke, as I was mentioning earlier, had commanded Gort's Second Corps during the retreat to Dunkirk, probably the greatest fighting retreat conducted in the 20th century, also multiply decorated in the First World War. Likewise with Montgomery, Montgomery was a very seasoned combat commander, very seasoned tactician. Very odd duck, Montgomery was, even by the standards of British generals who were all a little weird. He was a teetotaler and he didn't smoke. And the first time that Eisenhower went to his headquarters, Eisenhower, who was about a 4-pack-a-day smoker at the time, lit up. And Montgomery was like, who has lit up a cigarette here? Put it out right away. And it was like kind of a jerk about it. Okay, if you're a non-smoker, you don't want people smoking around you. I respect that. But he talked to Eisenhower about it in a way that Eisenhower didn't like very much, and Eisenhower was really steamed. One thing that's important to remember, too, about the way that the British wanted to conduct the Second World War as opposed to the way we wanted to conduct it is that we had each taken different lessons from the First World War. The British had learned that what you needed to do was apply maximum force to a small area, break through, and then exploit the breakthrough. What we had learned coming in later with a lot of men and material was, let's just attack across a broad front and the enemy just won't have the resources to hang with us, right? And so Eisenhower was all about, well, we want to create these attacks across a broad front. And Montgomery said, no, what we want to do is we want to find the weak point in the German lines and smash them there and go through and then make them react to us when we do that. To the extent that Eisenhower let Montgomery do what he wanted to do, Montgomery was okay with him. But both Montgomery, Brooke was constantly going to Churchill and saying, oh my God, this Eisenhower guy is a disaster. If he would just not try and manage the war, but just do the things that the Supreme Commander needed to do just in terms of kind of overall theater politics, he would be great. But to the extent that he involves himself in the kind of day-to-day military operations, he's a disaster, and you need to stop him. Now, Eisenhower got better. His work in North Africa was not that great. His work in Italy was also not super, although a lot of that, part of it was the bad plan. Those of you who know something about the Salerno landing, it's basically we landed at the bottom of a teacup and the Germans just got to sort of shoot down at us for several weeks. But a lot of that was unfortunate planning on the ground. A lot of it was that Mark Clark was not perhaps as tactically savvy a general as one could have hoped. By the same token, at a certain point, they were like, well, okay, we're kind of having stalemate here in Italy. What we're going to do is land the 82nd Airborne outside of Rome because the Italians are on sort of verge of collapse. And Matt Ridgway, who was the general of the 82nd Airborne at that point, said, no, this is a terrible idea. There's 2 German divisions right there. We'll just be ground to dust in between them. And on the morning that the 82nd Airborne was about to fly out for this drop on Rome, finally, Ridgway prevailed on Eisenhower to say, no, this is a terrible idea, you've got to stop. In the planning for Operation Overlord, the invasion of the D-Day invasions, originally the commander was going to be George Marshall. George Marshall is a really interesting guy, by the way. I have a couple of things to say about him. One is that George Marshall was extremely formal. Eisenhower didn't mind if people called him Ike. George Marshall was General Marshall to everybody. And as a matter of fact, at one point, Franklin Delano Roosevelt called him George. And Marshall said, that's General Marshall, President. But they picked Eisenhower, and the reason was Roosevelt thought that moving Marshall out of his position as chief of the general staff would be so disruptive that what they really needed was Eisenhower, who was similarly skilled but was already in Europe. So there's not, I'm not going to go through the sort of the fight for Europe, much as I think it's a fascinating story, and probably I will give more lectures in the future about that if we want to talk about the military history of the invasion of Europe. It's a topic I find really fascinating. Those of you who've listened to these talks with me before will know that because my grandfather was a tank commander in the 6th Armored Division, I have a sort of fascination with it. But there is a story to tell here about Eisenhower, and it's this. So after VE Day, Eisenhower writes a letter to George Marshall in which he says, I would like to be relieved of duty as Supreme Commander because I want to divorce my wife and I want to marry Kay Summersby. And George Marshall writes him back and says, if you do this, I will bust you right out of the Army. This absolutely does not fly. You cannot do this. And we know this from two sources. There was a fellow named Mattingly who was in signals, was a signals operator, and saw the sort of traffic between the Supreme Headquarters, the Allied Expeditionary Force, or the Allied Forces, and Washington. So he saw this, and he talked to somebody about it in the 50s. And then Truman, who also knew about it, gave an interview in 1973 after Eisenhower and his wife were both dead, in which he told a reporter, yeah, this is a thing that happened. This will come up later. Eisenhower was a guy with a lot of personal discipline, not surprisingly. And here's another sort of interestingly useless story about Eisenhower. When he became president of Colombia, which was the next job that he had after the end of the war, he quit. He was sort of impressed upon him that he should quit smoking. He was about a 3.5, 4-pack a day smoker, and he stopped smoking then and never smoked again. So he was a guy who could exert a great force of will, and likewise, and he wrote this letter to Kay Summersby saying, well, it's been nice being with you, I'm moving on, and he went back to the United States and got back with Mamie, and that was all she wrote, so to speak. So when he comes back to the United States, he's sort of looking around for things to do, and the trustees of Columbia University are looking to replace the president. Eisenhower's really fascinated by this job. What he really wanted to do was be a sort of college president in the sort of like in the way that General Lee had been a college president after this, later in his life. He really wanted to kind of mold young hearts and minds, and I don't think he really realized what it was going to be like to be president of Columbia, which is this sort of sprawling institution. It doesn't have that many undergrads. At the time, I think it only had about 2,500 undergrads out of more than 20,000 students. It's much more a graduate research institution. He did a lot of good at Columbia. He was a very good fundraiser. He organized the administration in a way that was more effective than it had been heretofore. But he was also, at the time, involved in the reconfiguration of the U.S. Armed Forces. They were going away from having separate departments of the Army, the Navy, and unifying the command structure into a sort of unified command structure with the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the top. And so he was gone a lot of the time. He was usually down in D.C. 2 or 3 days a week, and then he was also sort of giving talks and doing this and that. He wrote his memoirs. By the way, his memoirs, which are called The Crusade in Europe, are, with the possible exception of Grant's memoirs, probably the best memoirs written by an American general in the entire 200 plus years of the Republic. I mean, they're really, I commend to you, any of you who have never read Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs. They are the absolute gold standard. They're written beautifully but very concisely. My grandfather, who had been a military commander, he sent me a copy of Grant's memoirs at one point, and he said, what I really wish is that when I had been in the Army, people had been as sort of clear about what they wanted people to do as they apparently were in the course of Grant's command. But he made quite an amount of money from doing it, from writing his memoirs, as Grant did. By the way, those of you who don't know, Grant was broke, basically, and wrote his memoirs and made so much money from it. He died right when he finished them, but it sort of set his family up. 1951, he gets asked by Truman if he'll be the supreme commander of NATO. So they're creating this new sort of combined military force in Europe. They need somebody who's good at kind of negotiating among services, which Eisenhower was very good at. They also needed somebody who could relate to the Soviets reasonably well. Eisenhower had met Zhukov, the Russian supreme commander, and they really liked each other. They wrote some very warm letters to each other, and so there was a certain point at which, by the way, this is a story that some of you are familiar with maybe, but Eisenhower during the war was talking to Zhukov about Russian military practice, and they were talking about, the U.S. had these tanks for clearing minefields that had a kind of a flail on the front of it with kind of chains. Zhukov was like, well, usually when we come up on a minefield, we bring up a division and they go through it, division of infantry. And Eisenhower said, isn't that kind of costly? And Zhukov said, well, we did a calculation that if the Germans were defending it in force, we would lose roughly the same number of people doing it. So it was really a kind of mathematical decision, but it's one of those things that, in the Red Army makes a little more sense. Stalin, I think it was, once said that you had to be really brave to be a coward in the Red Army. In 1952, the talk starts going for Eisenhower as president, and this is not the first time. As a matter of fact, Truman had there had been talk of the Democrats running Eisenhower for president in 1948, and Truman had told Eisenhower, I will step aside for you if you want to make a run for president. And Eisenhower said, I don't know who the next commander-in-chief is going to be, but it's not going to be me. Truman and Eisenhower once again got along pretty well, by and large. Truman really liked Eisenhower. Eisenhower's problem at this point was that Robert Taft, who was the sort of presumptive nominee, had already accumulated a lot of delegates. The problem for the Republicans was that, like Thomas Dewey before him, Taft was very unlikable. There's nobody who met Robert Taft and was like, wow, I really feel like I know the guy and like him. Nobody, he was he was extremely conservative, and that's fine. If you're going to be a Republican, that's kind of par for the course. But he was he was highly isolationist, and he was just not a very engaging person. Whereas Eisenhower really was, and especially Eisenhower was terrible. If you ever see him speaking from notes, he's very bad at it. But when Eisenhower spoke off the cuff, he's a very engaging guy. And at this point, Lucius Clay, who was another general and also who had been the sort of head of the Allied military government in Germany. By the way, if you go down to the southern part of Berlin, you will see the Clay Allee. There's a lot of streets in Berlin that are named after U.S. generals, Clay being one, John McCloy being another. And the reason is because, by the way, in case you're interested in this, the older Germans are very grateful to us. Because not only did we destroy Nazism, which I mean, many of them were fairly sympathetic to, let's be clear, but we saved them from the Soviets taking over the whole country. And believe me, if you talk to any German who's over about the age of 60, they will tell you that they were pretty glad that the Soviets did not take over the whole of the country. So they managed to insert Eisenhower into the Republican primary, and he manages to kind of get over Taft, Taft is actually pretty gracious about the whole thing. Another thing that happens, by the way, in this time, Eisenhower gets inducted into the Augusta National Golf Club, which is a very select, I think there was at the time only 130 members. And he gets associated with these, number one, a lot of like high-end professional golfers. As a matter of fact, during the 1952 political campaign, there were bumper stickers around that said, Ben Hogan for president, if we're going to have a golfer, let's have a good one. Eisenhower was a very avid golfer. I don't know how things will turn out with Mr. Trump. Eisenhower played probably the second most rounds of golf while president. He played probably around 800 rounds of golf while president. The number one was, by a long length, was Wilson, who played about 1,600 rounds of golf. But it was under doctor's orders, weirdly enough. He had a arterial condition, and the doctor said, well, you need to get out and walk around. And apparently, by the way, Wilson also was a terrible golfer. He took like 25 shots at one time to finish the par 4 second on the golf course in DC. Does anyone know who, in terms of their handicap, was apparently the best golfer among US presidents, so far as we know? Kennedy. Kennedy was apparently a scratch golfer, which is a pretty remarkable thing to know given the condition of his back. But Kennedy also didn't like it getting around. Like he thought that, he already felt like people kind of thought he was a sort of blue blood, which he was. But he thought that if people got around that he liked to play golf, that it would sort of detract from his reputation. But also Eisenhower, in the context of joining the Augusta National Golf Club, gets to sort of hang around with a lot of very wealthy, very conservative businessmen who have a kind of influence on his politics. He hadn't really thought, I don't think, a great deal about American politics up to this point. So there's an interesting thing that goes on. What's happening right at this time is the beginnings of the Cold War. The Cold War really starts in 1948, or 49, depending on how you count. But one of the things that happens is a very intense communist scare in the United States, particularly sort of because of the influence of the junior senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy was a very unlikable person with not a lot of connections in the Congress, and he really decided that his thing was going to be rooting communists out of government. He was there's been some attempts to rehabilitate McCarthy in the last 10 or 15 years, especially by Pat Buchanan, and I think they're really misguided. McCarthy was a drunk and a bully, and a guy who played the media. He was constantly sort of making accusations about people at 5:30 on Friday so that they would percolate in the press all weekend before anyone could get around to the next news cycle to defend themselves. And he also made a lot of accusations about people with not a lot of evidence. So Eisenhower, there's a number of interesting stories to tell about the beginning of the Eisenhower administration when he's elected in November 1952. Number one, he starts sort of assembling his cabinet, and all of a sudden, like McCarthy starts raising all these issues. So the first one, he wants to make Walter Beadle Smith, General Walter Beadle Smith, I believe the Secretary of Defense. But in any case, he wants to draft him into the government. And McCarthy comes out and says, McCarthy and some of his other allies, well, Smith, worked with the Soviets and this and that. Now, this is a funny thing. If you know anything about Walter Beadle Smith, I mean, to say that Walter Beadle Smith was in any way a communist is like arguing that Donald Trump is like a radical feminist secretly. I mean, it's just, Walter Beadle Smith's politics were, according to Eisenhower, slightly to the right of those espoused by Attila the Hun. So the idea that Walter Beadle Smith was either by act or by omission someone, with any sympathy to communism is a ridiculous idea. And this made McCarthy very angry when it happened. Likewise, he wanted Chip Bolin to serve in the government. Chip Bolin had been Roosevelt's State Department Russia specialist. And once again, McCarthy and his allies sort of conflated people who knew a lot about the Soviet Union and people who thought that we could deal with them with people who were sympathetic to communism. And once again, Chip Bolin is a person who was very clear about what was up in the Soviet Union. I mean, was by no stretch of the imagination a communist. McCarthy, it really frustrated Eisenhower, and Eisenhower constantly, when Edward R. Murrow staged his famous broadcast in which he sort of critiqued McCarthy, which was sort of the beginning of McCarthy's kind of downfall, Eisenhower then invited him to the White House. Now, Murrow, too, was one of these guys, this is Edward R. Murrow, who was absolutely beyond, he was really viewed as above criticism. There was no, I mean, it was a real damaging moment for McCarthy when Murrow came out and was publicly critical of him, because Murrow was clearly not a communist. Murrow had stood on the rooftops during the Blitz, and he was very well known and well loved. Like, for those of you who were fans of WKRP in Cincinnati, Les Nessman, the news guy, who was slightly crazy, but also was very conservative and very anti-communist, was a great fan and respecter of Edward R. Murrow, and well, he might be. The real downfall of McCarthy was when he decided, he had sort of created these accusations that the government, the State Department, the Army were shot through with communists. And he staged these hearings, and he ran up against this fellow, Joseph Welch, who's a very urbane lawyer from Boston, who was defending rebutting the charges against the Army. And he, as a way of attacking Welch, said, well, there's this guy, Fred Fisher, in your law firm, who in the 1940s briefly was a member of the Lawyers Guild. The Lawyers Guild was a sort of civil liberties group. It was viewed as kind of a communist front group. It probably wasn't. In any case, Fisher was only a member of the Lawyers Guild for a couple of months. Welch was just incensed by this, that basically McCarthy was going out to try and ruin this guy's reputation on the basis of no real evidence that the guy had any sort of communist sympathies. And in the middle of the hearing, they have this exchange, which hopefully we'll play. I'm not going to, Welch says, no, we're not going to do this, At long last, Senator McCarthy, have you left no sense of decency? And McCarthy is left sort of like, there's a tremendous applause for Welch, and McCarthy is left kind of like shouting into the wind, and this was kind of the beginning of the end for McCarthy. And it was because Welch had been willing to sort of stand up and say, look, we're not going to do this. We're not going to do the politics of baseless accusation and destruction of people's career for political advantage. And this, my father, whenever this would come on TV, my father would kind of tear up, because he thought it was really one of the most powerful moments in American political history, when finally, nobody, okay, communism was a threat, let's be clear. Nobody with a lick of sense wants to live under Stalinism. Like, anybody who had a chance to get away from Stalinism did it as quickly as they could. And Eisenhower was by no means in any way, shape, or form sympathetic to communism. But what he doesn't want is the kind of politics of accusation going on, which deplete the strength of the US government, deplete American society by creating this kind of culture of fear, this culture of mutual accusation and mutual suspicion. One of the first things that happens in the Eisenhower administration is the Castle Bravo bomb test in March 1954. This is the first hydrogen bomb test. It's a gigantic explosion. I'm going to play a little bit of this thing, which is what was sort of meaning to be played before. Okay. Why is the volume not working? Hold on.
That's then paving the way to producing aircraft deliverable hydrogen bombs and more effective weapons.
This thing was called the Shrimp, by the way, which... It was originally projected that the explosion would be about 6 megatons, which is about 60 times the size of or 50 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. It turned out to be 2.5 times that size, about 15 megatons, and it was so big that there was a moment at which, there was one of these moments that frequently happens in nuclear testing when the scientists were not totally sure that it wasn't going to ignite the atmosphere. Interestingly, Eisenhower, okay, that's a beautiful but disturbing picture. I'm going to take it off of there. Had been of the opinion after the dropping of after the end of the Second World War, that we should share nuclear technology with the Soviets. And his reasoning for it was this: he was convinced that they were going to get it anyway, which they did. And his thought was, since they're going to get it anyway, we might as well create some goodwill with them if we can. So there's a debate that goes on in the upper echelons of the US government about how we're going to deal with the Soviets. And some of you remember from the last lecture what's called the long telegram that George Kennan sends from Moscow, in which he says the Soviets are sort of unalterably opposed to our system, and Truman lays out the Truman Doctrine, which is we're going to oppose communist aggression wherever it happens. Eisenhower's view, at least in the beginning, is we need to do things a little differently, and part of the reason was because he didn't think that the US government could afford to involve itself in a series of extensive military engagements. Okay, so I want to jump back for 1 second, and I meant to sort of tell this story. I'm going to tell it quickly. And it was about McCarthy. So at a certain point in the 1952 political campaign, McCarthy said that he was going to give this speech outing, as he referred to it, punks, pansies, and pinkos in the Adlai-Stevenson campaign. Adlai-Stevenson was a Democratic presidential candidate. And he was going to accuse Stevenson of being a homosexual, which, in addition to being completely irrelevant, was also not true. And staffers at the White House got wind of this, and they called up Eisenhower and said, if McCarthy gives this speech, we will release publicly Marshall's letter to you in response to your request to be relieved of duty and to divorce your wife. And Eisenhower's people called up McCarthy and said, don't do it. And McCarthy didn't. Now, McCarthy had a sort of beef with Truman, and not McCarthy, excuse me. Well, McCarthy didn't like Truman very much at all. But Eisenhower had a sort of beef with Truman, and part of the reason was that it was commonplace, or it was traditional for the president to have the presidential candidates into the White House to get a security briefing. And so he had Adlai-Stevenson in, and he detailed Omar Bradley, who by that point was the chief of staff of the Army, to invite Eisenhower. And Bradley, for whatever reason, failed to do it. And Eisenhower was very upset by this. So Eisenhower, another thing that was traditional was, on Inauguration Day, for the incoming president to drive to the White House, go inside, have, maybe a little meal or whatever, and then go with the president to the inauguration. Hoover hadn't done it with FDR because he had been apprised that FDR couldn't walk. And so as a courtesy, Hoover had come out of the White House and joined Roosevelt in his car. By the way, Truman had, also as a courtesy, and quite secretly, not telling either Eisenhower or John Eisenhower, Eisenhower's son. John Eisenhower was a major in the US Army serving in Korea. He secretly had John Eisenhower sent back to the United States so he could attend the inauguration as a sort of nice thing for Dwight Eisenhower. Anyway, so Dwight Eisenhower gets to the White House, and Bess Truman has laid out this sort of spread. They're going to have a nice tea. And Eisenhower just won't go in. And finally, Truman has to troop out to the car and just get in the car with him and drive to the inauguration. And the only conversation they have along the whole way is Eisenhower says to Truman, who was it who had my son sent back? And Truman said, well, it was me. And that's it. And other than that, he kind of freezes him out. Well, also, in this period, Truman, who knew of the existence of these things, got the copies of the correspondence between Eisenhower and George Marshall and destroyed them as a courtesy to Eisenhower, because he thought that it would be damaging for Eisenhower and damaging for the country if it ever got out. And so he had them destroyed. And Eisenhower clearly found out about this, because about 2 weeks later, Eisenhower wrote him actually a very cordial letter in which he thanked him for getting his son into town. And also, it's clear if you sort of like read between the lines in the letter, there's something else going on. And it's pretty clear that Eisenhower must have known that Truman had had this correspondence destroyed. But still, Eisenhower really didn't warm to Truman, and they didn't really reconcile until John F. Kennedy's funeral in 1963, which is really too bad, because Truman was a pretty good guy. I mean, he was the kind of guy you could sit down and have a beer with, and, and really, so was Eisenhower. I mean, Eisenhower was not a bad guy. It's very funny that he hardballed Truman in this way. Anyway, the upshot of the Castle Bravo bomb test is that Eisenhower is very convinced, or very sort of alive to the fact, that nuclear weapons really change the equation. And what he's trying to do is stay out of the kind of conflicts in which nuclear weapons are going to get used. So he runs on a platform of, we're going to get out of Korea. And he eventually goes to Korea and meets with Mark Clark, who's commanding the 8th Army. And Clark, they have this long meeting, it runs until about 3 in the morning. Clark's like, yeah, we can win this thing. We've been in a stalemate for 19 months on the 38th parallel. But, with some more money and men, and with some, more aggressive generalship, we can win this thing. Eisenhower's just like, no way. This is not happening. Sorry. I mean, I'm glad you're, enthusiastic about it, but there's no way it can happen. And so Eisenhower decides that what needs to happen is that he wants to sort of find out if they can extend an olive branch to the North Koreans and the Chinese. And the thing that really motive moment of this is the death of Stalin in March 1953. Eisenhower takes this as a kind of moment at which, now the Korean War is very unpopular in the United States. According to one survey, only 34% of Americans thought the war was worth fighting at this point. The Americans are very tired of ongoing wars. So Eisenhower decides he's going to extend this olive branch to the sort of communist world. He gives a speech to the American Society of Newspaper Editors on April 16th, 1953. And it's very much an anti-war speech. He says, among other things, and I think that this really tells you a lot about Eisenhower's character and his view of the world. Every gun that is made, every warship that is launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its labors, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 people. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete highway. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This, I repeat, is the best way of life to be found on the road that the world has been taking. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. And this is a compelling thing for a US president to be saying, 1953. And it's one of those things kind of like Nixon going to China, right? It's hard to imagine that a Democrat could get out there and say that in this context. But Eisenhower, because he had the credibility of having been the commander of the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, could get out there and say, look, if there's a way for us to make peace, we don't like your system. I mean, he's clear that the Soviet system is a brutal and unjust system, but what we need to do is create a world that's not burning up its resources in these pointless wars. Now what changes with Eisenhower too is U.S. foreign policy becomes much less about the things that the Truman Doctrine was pushing, sort of military intervention, and much more about covert intervention, so that we see a series of projects undertaken. So fairly early in the Eisenhower administration, the Korean armistice is signed. And what we see is a series of operations undertaken in Iran, in Guatemala. Those are the two particular ones in which the US government has the CIA overthrowing governments that it views as overly sympathetic to communism. So in 1951, in Iran, starting in the late 1940s, there's an upsurge of democratic politics. They try to assassinate the Shah. The Shah says, well, the fact that people are getting so agitated and wanting to kill me means that we need to have like more democracy, weirdly enough. Usually the calculation is the reverse. Mohammad Mossadegh becomes appointed prime minister, and he nationalizes the holdings of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had signed a lease with the Pahlavi government, 1933, a 60-year lease in which they were going to get all the profits from Iranian oil. And Mossadegh nationalizes the AIOC. The British government goes very upset about this. And the US government looks at this and says, well, Mossadegh, like, he's not communist, but he's kind of communist adjacent. And Iran has this long border with the Soviet Union, which did at the time, doesn't quite anymore because of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So he has the CIA go in and overthrow Mossadegh and put in his place Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who we know as the Shah, who was deposed by Khomeini and his people in the 1970s and who then eventually died in the United States, who Pahlavi basically destroys democracy in Iran, and you can really point, and has a very brutal regime that made very much use of torture, and you can kind of see the growth of Shiite radicalism in Iran as, in a lot of respects, a sort of outgrowth of the destruction of the democratically elected government of Iran and its replacement with the Pahlavi dictatorship. Guatemala, 1944, the dictator Jorge Ubico is overthrown. Ubico had signed agreements with United Fruit. Guatemala was a very unequal society, let's just say. About 2% of the population owned about 72% of the agricultural land. United Fruit owned between 20 and 40% of the arable land, but only used about 15% of it. The rest was kept fallow so as not to glut the banana market. So Jacopo Arbenz Guzman is elected in March 1951. He has a couple of sort of communistic type people in his government. But what he does is say, okay, United Fruit, what we're going to do is we're going to nationalize this land and distribute it to poor farmers. And we're going to pay you back in government bonds based on the value of your land as you reported on your tax forms. So you reported that this land is worth $650,000 roughly. So we're going to give you these bonds for $650,000. United Fruit was like, wait. This land is actually worth $15 million. And the Guzman government was like, well, the Arbenz government said, it's funny that you say that, because on your tax forms you only say that it's worth this other amount of money. United Fruit was very well connected in the US government. Allen Dulles, I believe, had been their lawyer in Boston, if I'm not mistaken. But what happens is this sort of, one of the first real PR campaigns in the history of America. Like the CIA starts running these kind of junkets for reporters down to Guatemala to show Guatemala is being taken over by communists, and it kind of builds this thing until finally the CIA then gets together some sort of Guatemalan dissidents under a fellow named Castillo Armas and invades and stages a coup in July of 1954, which restores things to the kind of status quo ante. And once again, this is a kind of CIA, we're not going to send a bunch of American troops. We're going to try and sort of sort this out through the back door. Another example of this, the French, the French had been kind of kicked out of Indochina, subsequently Vietnam, by the Japanese during the Second World War. A group of sort of Indo-Chinese native guerrillas had done a lot to push the Japanese out. They were led by Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh, by the way, was a founding member of the French Communist Party. He had been at the Versailles Conference, at which he had tried to get Wilson to sort of make a commitment, you know, like self-determination, right, for people. And Wilson was like, well, we didn't really mean you people. So we become committed to helping the French. The funny thing was, sort of, there's a really funny part. I really recommend watching the early episodes of the older PBS documentary on the Vietnam War, because there's a really great moment. Sort of Ho Chi Minh wrote this kind of declaration of Vietnamese independence, and he modeled it on the U.S. Declaration of Independence, I mean, very clearly. And he took it to the U.S. ambassador and said, you know, tomorrow I'm going to do this in the central square of Hanoi. And the U.S. ambassador's like, oh my God. Like, because on the one hand, he doesn't want, he knows what kind of problems it's going to cause. But he looks at this and he's like, oh my God, this is the U.S. Declaration of Independence. What are we going to do about this, right? It's very embarrassing for these people to be coming out, like, espousing the principles that we ostensibly are in favor of. The French managed to make a complete hatchet. This is a really interesting sort of, there's a number of really good books about the French war in Indochina that were written by a guy named Bernard Fall, who was a French student and then reporter. He wrote a book called The Street Without Joy, which is about the war in general, and he wrote a history of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu was this sort of thing, it was kind of like Khe Sanh, for those of you who know the history of the American war in Vietnam. They set up this base in a kind of isolated valley in the northern part of Vietnam, and they were like, well, we'll draw the Viet Minh forces out and we'll destroy them. And then every other military guy who looked at that was like, this is suicide, there's no way this possibly works. And it was, in fact. Fall wrote this book called Hell in a Very Small Place, which I think we have in the library and which I really recommend. We assisted with strategic bombing of the hills around Dien Bien Phu. The US pilots that flew the mission said that the flak cover was heavier than the flak cover had been over Berlin. The Viet Minh had managed to, like, physically haul anti-aircraft batteries up to the tops of the mountains, which the French were convinced they wouldn't be able to do. And then the U.S. Army comes to Eisenhower and says, well, we need to consider dropping a tactical nuclear weapon. And Eisenhower just says, not a chance, right? We've already dropped a nuclear weapon on Asians once. We're not going to do this again. So Eisenhower was very convinced that we had to find a kind of conventional way through our problems. There's what's called the New Look in American foreign policy that gets formulated in 1953 and 1954. And the idea is we're not going to, like, militarily engage in the way that the Truman Doctrine said that we would. John Foster Dulles, after whom I am not named, by the way, with no disrespect intended, came out in the speech of the Council on Foreign Relations in which he promised, like, massive retaliation. And his sort of implication was, well, we're not going to, like, send troops everywhere, but maybe we're going to, like, you know, drop a bomb on you, a big one. And Eisenhower wants to say, that's not really what we mean. What we mean is we're going to sort of, like, apply pressure, but we're not going to be inserting US troops, because it creates a couple of problems. One is it jacks up the federal budget. And Eisenhower was very much cognizant of the fact that he had been brought in to try and balance the federal budget, which he does. I'm going to play a bit of Eisenhower's very famous farewell address, because I think that this, better than anything else, really sums up his politics. So the 22nd Amendment having been passed in 1951, he couldn't run for a third term. He probably, I certainly think he would have been the nominee over Nixon. Whether he could have beaten Kennedy is an open question. But let's see if this will work.
To feel that some spectacular and costly promises to be of indefinite duration. To meet it successfully, there is called for not so much the emotional and transitory sacrifices of crisis, but rather those which enable us to carry forward steadily, surely, and without complaint, the burdens of a prolonged and complex struggle with liberty, the state. Only thus shall we remain, despite every provocation, on our charted course toward permanent peace and human power. Crises there will continue to be. In meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small, there is a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. A huge increase in newer elements of our defenses, development of unrealistic programs to cure every ill in agriculture, a dramatic expansion in basic and applied research. These and many other possibilities, each possibly promising itself, may be suggested as the only way to the road we wish to travel. But each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration, the need to maintain balance in and among national programs. Balance between the private and the public economy. Balance between the cost and hoped for advantages. Balance between the clearly necessary and the comfortably desirable. Balance between our essential requirements as a nation and the duties imposed by the nation upon the individual. Balance between actions of the moment and the national welfare of the future. Good judgment seeks balance in progress. Lack of it eventually finds imbalance and frustration. But threats, new in kind or degree, constantly arise. Of these I mention two moments. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Okay, so I just want to close by saying, since I've now managed to get to the end of my time, that I think that this is a really remarkable, I mean, imagine a US president delivering that speech now, right? It's very hard to imagine. But once again, Eisenhower had the credibility to get out there and say, look, you know, he'd been a soldier. He knew exactly what military hardware could do. He knew what the transformation that had been wrought on American society by the Second World War. I mean, there's a really great book called The Arsenal of Democracy about Roosevelt's attempts to kind of rejig the US economy to fight the Second World War. But what he's saying is that the fundamental aspects of American democracy and American society have to be protected against concentrations of power that will distort the sort of normal course of Americans deciding amongst themselves how they want to organize society. And this, I think, is Eisenhower's true brilliance as a president of the United States. That he was willing, he wasn't one of these guys who was a stone-cold partisan. As a matter of fact, the Democrats supported his defense budgets down the line. The Republican Party was split about 60-30. 30% of Republicans tended to vote against his defense budgets because they thought that cost too much. But here was a guy who saw the kind of modern requirements of fighting. I mean, he knew the Cold War is going to go on. For the foreseeable future, we're going to be confronting a system that is inimical to our own. But what is important is that we not let the struggle against that system, even with the best of intentions, destroy the democratic fundaments of American society. And if you want to take away from Eisenhower the essence of the guy's brilliance, it's not that he was a great battlefield commander, as he's sometimes thought of. It's that he was a person who understood the way American society worked in a kind of grassroots level better than a lot of the people in government at that time. And the true contribution that he makes to American government is to call upon us to think about where the power lies in society and what effect that has on the maintenance of American government. Oh my gosh, I've talked for 90 whole minutes. Thanks for your patience. I can answer some questions now. Thank you for coming out. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know what Kay Summersby did after the war?
She wrote a book about that. She married someone else, and I can't remember the guy's name. But she, so what she was saying was kind of viewed as scandalous, and people really wanted to forget it. But she was very. I mean, if you read her book, which I have, it's pretty clear that she. I mean, she could not have. She could have made it up. But the texture of it is such that it's very hard to believe that she was not telling the truth. And in fact, lots of people knew that it was going on. Omar Bradley was, if you read his letters, like he very clearly knew it was going on. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
I got a question.
Yes.
They say President Grant and Eisenhower, they were good generals as far as being president. Now, I don't know. I'm just asking. They say that they were the two worst presidents around. I'm just asking.
Grant's reputation, I think, has improved lately. I recommend Ron Chernow's recent book about Grant. He was absolutely a fascinating guy and someone who's gotten kind of short shrift. He was an excellent general, not as tactically astute as Lee, but Grant, let's be clear, understood the nature of the war. I mean, there's that moment at which he says, I intend to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer, which was the moment that he really won the war, because he knew that every casualty that Lee took, you know, was a much greater loss to him than it was to Grant. Likewise, I think that Eisenhower was actually quite a good president. He didn't try to do too much. And if you look at I have a great respect for John F. Kennedy, but John F. Kennedy's presidency is just marked by the attempt to do too much. And it comes to grief very often. I'll tell you this other story, which is slightly unrelated, but which I meant to relate earlier. So Eisenhower was a Christian, but didn't go to church very much. He was very, very profoundly religious, but didn't go to church very much. And he was told by one of his advisors when he became president, well, you need to join a church. So he joined one of the local sort of Presbyterian churches. And then the advisor said to him, well, you guys should have a prayer before the beginning of the cabinet meetings. And so Eisenhower said, well, that sounds like a good idea. Well, I'll ask the other guys in the cabinet what they think. So they had this discussion about it, and they said, well, okay, we're going to have a silent prayer before the beginning of the cabinet meeting. So they come down to the first cabinet meeting, and they all get in the room, and Eisenhower just sort of starts up with the business, and they're going on for about 15 minutes, and Eisenhower sort of looks up. It's, God damn it, we forgot the silent prayer. Eisenhower was notoriously foul-mouthed, by the way, too. So, yes, ma'am.
Where did you get the name Ike from?
Well, Ike sort of as a shorting for Eisenhower, because it sounded close to Eisenhower. Yeah, I have that question too, because it's not, nobody calls Dwights Ikes, right? I mean, I think that's Ike is usually short for Isaac, and his name was Dwight David Eisenhower. I think it was just because Ike seemed like short for Eisenhower, and Eisenhower was a long name. That's my only answer for it. Go ahead.
One episode I remember that took place during the Eisenhower administration was the Little Rock Nine.
Yeah.
Arkansas, where the 9 students wanted to attend the school and troops were sent down
Right.
to get them to integrate. How come, like in his administration, why wasn't that same sort of tactic used in schools like in Mississippi and Alabama?
Partly because they didn't want to. Eisenhower wanted to avoid, if he could, inserting the federal government into state issues. I mean, he really, he was not a pronounced anti-segregationist in the way that Truman was, I don't think. Although he was not, I mean, he had more enlightened views than a lot of people sort of earlier on. But I think it was mostly a kind of federalism issue. Like he didn't want to, and also that was like not an entirely satisfactory result from either side. Like the students who were sent in there, it was an intensely traumatizing experience for them, and necessary in the course of getting U.S. society to live up to the promises that are in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. But I think that in the same way that Kennedy, Kennedy didn't really want to be inserting U.S. federal power into that environment because he thought that politically it didn't create a long-term a process that was viable, if you see what I'm saying. Any other questions? All right, thank you so much for coming out. I hope to see you in December for Alexander Hamilton at the Concord Senior Center.